Hello, my name is Charlotte and I'm a Year 13 student who currently studies at a British international school in the Middle East. And today I'm going to be talking about diversity, equity and inclusivity with a focus on the sixth form experience. So to begin with, I wanted to talk about the definitions of diversity, equity and inclusivity just before I begin talking about my main areas of discussion. So diversity is the differences that exist already in society, especially to do with marginalized communities, and that can be due to race, gender, religion, language, disability, the list goes on. And I think that a lot of institutions make the mistake of thinking that diversity is something that we strive for or something that can be achieved. Diversity is always there. The differences between groups is always going to exist, whether it's acknowledged or not. The differences always exist. And I think it's the equity and the inclusivity where the institutions come in and where that includes the role of them sort of striving for something. So equity is next up, and that is the promotion of justice and fairness and also impartiality when it comes to the distribution of resources within procedures and processes that an institution might undergo. And that on a sort of authority level, I think is where schools come in. They can promote equity in terms of being impartial to the differences and providing fair and equal treatment to all the different diverse groups. And then that's where inclusivity is the final stop, because inclusivity is sort of the outcome that we get. So if we have exclusion and then we strive for equity during the integration process, and then we result in inclusivity. And inclusivity is obviously, that feeling that diverse groups are being heard, they're being seen, there is a place for everyone, there's a platform and there's a voice, and representation is key to that. So those are the sort of main terms that I wanted to outline first, and I did my main research for this on the Diversity, Equity and Inclusivity website. So that's a great place for sixth form students and anyone who wants to sort of kind of introduce themselves to the topic to go and have a look. So firstly, I wanted to talk about why sixth form, what's crucial at that age and how DEI comes into it. So sixth form is obviously a form of further education, and it's arguable that if you are choosing to be a sixth form student and to pursue that level of further education, that you want to be there. And so I think that is a key factor that we need to remember when talking about DEI. And obviously this is ages 16 to 18, and we are young adults who are forming our own opinions and really solidifying who we are as people, and our interactions with peers and teachers are quite abundant and crucial at this level. And it's a period of the school experience where you're really getting involved in a lot of real life discussions and topics. I've noticed personally from taking A-levels that a lot of the content covered, there's a lot of real life application, and we tend to branch off into a lot of different discussions about what's currently happening in the world. And to link that into the sort of international school environment, I think that's where international schools have an upper hand. They have a benefit. For me personally, I've been at my school, which is an international school, for my entire school career, and I've had the privilege of being able to be immersed amongst other diverse groups for the whole time. And because of that, I find myself naturally being inclusive. And that's what I've noticed, that especially on a peer-to-peer level, that being immersed in that international community has made us inclusive individuals, and we naturally sort of strive for that inclusivity and have that understanding. And I think that's quite inspiring because it shows that it's easily achievable. It's not necessarily something that we've had to be taught, and I think there's a misconception that it's almost impossible or it's difficult to strive for inclusivity. I don't think so. Equity perhaps, because it's more on a systemic level, but especially what I've noticed amongst my sixth form peers is that I have some of the most enriching and interesting and inclusive conversations when we're talking just on a peer-to-peer basis. So during this level, obviously, we are being prepared for later life and most people are pursuing university and higher education, and so we have a mindset that's very expansive, and we're constantly looking to grow individually and as groups. And I think that is where inclusivity comes in. So like I've mentioned, equity I'm going to separate to be something that's more for the institution to strive for, whereas inclusivity I think is what we can do on a peer/student level. So that is where we're sort of looking to make each other's voices heard, allowing each other the places and the platforms to do that. But it starts within schools, and the school should be the environment that you can do that in, a safe environment that is mediated by an authority figure, and a place where you can feel that you can have discussions, whether it's to do with race, gender, language, religion, whatever the different sector might be. We should be able to have those discussions, and I find them being quite prominent within the sixth form environment because, like I said, we're all sort of striving to know more about each other and know more about the world. So then to link into what diversity and inclusivity actually looks like within the sixth form environment, it's a lot of what I've said already, in that I haven't really seen issues with inclusivity, especially on a peer-to-peer and student-to-student level within the sixth form. But where there tends to be issues, if there are any, and the ones that I've experienced personally, have been on a peer-to-teacher level, which I find to be interesting. So naturally within international schools, the student body and cohort is diverse. There are different groups, there are different communities, and that isn't always reflected amongst the demographic of teachers, especially within the context of a British international school where we are learning a British curriculum. Naturally, the teachers tend to be British educated, if not from the UK themselves. And what that does is it does create a slight divide amongst students and teachers. And although this isn't necessarily harmful, I find that it isn't helpful per se, because it can perpetuate the notion that authority figures and roles of responsibility are segregated to Western individuals or even white individuals. And I think especially when we tend to see, as this has been my experience and also the experience of a lot of other individuals within international schools, that when you go up the ranks in terms of higher ranking authority figures, that there tends to be more males, and there tends to be more Western and white males, that can in itself perpetuate a stereotype. Like I said, even though those individuals may not be necessarily doing anything that's harmful or explicit towards perpetuating a stereotype, by default it does. And I think especially within the context of a sixth form, where the gap between student and teacher tends to get smaller, we see that within the context of the classroom, we're given a lot more responsibility, we are given a lot more independence, there's a lot more self-leading and just control over your own education. That gap between student and teacher shortens. We tend to find ourselves engaging in more discussions where we're expressing our own opinions as fully grown individuals and young adults. And so it is then extremely important that we feel that as diverse groups, that's being reflected in the authority that we're seeing. And I think from that, the overall message that we can be getting is quite harmful. And within the context of the sixth form, like I said, we are young adults whose opinions have been formed and who are, striving to kind of seek their own path and agenda in life. And the gap between student and teacher closes a little bit more, especially because we tend to be given a lot more independence and responsibility. We have to kind of take our own education into our own hands a lot more, with responsibility over the help that we seek and how we study and things like that. So when the demographic of a teacher comes into it a lot more, we're spending a lot more time with our teachers, especially because we study less subjects, so we're specializing a lot more, so we're around the same authority figures a lot more, and with that we need to be able to identify with them. And so if we're only seeing that certain demographics of teachers or authority figures or leaders within schools are present, then that can be harmful to us. And that's where I think that the role of the school comes in terms of striving for equity. So inclusivity on a peer-to-peer basis, as I've mentioned, is something that we can do, giving each other a voice, allowing each other to have these discussions and making a place for that. But equity in terms of impartiality when distributing resources and procedures and processes within a school is the role of the institution. And that leads me on to representation and what is representation and why it's important. So representation is obviously reflecting the diversity of the student body into the demographic of authority figures, at least within the context of a school, in my opinion. And naturally, like I said, within the international context, you're going to have a diverse student body. We see so many different cultures, so many different religions, ethnicities, genders, races. So that should be reflected within the teachers that we're speaking to, within the leaders, the safeguarding officers, because I think that when it comes to issues to do with diversity, that is when representation is most important, because that proves whether a school has properly striven for equity or not, and whether a school is properly inclusive. So for example, if there is a case of bullying to do with race and an individual is supposed to report this, who do they go to? Do they feel that they can go to someone? Have they seen examples before? Will they lead by example? So those processes need to be in place for students to feel safe enough to sort of discuss these things. And I think that's when it shows, it's like the real test of a diverse community is, can you report an issue about diversity? And that, I think, is so important when the demographic of authority figures is also diverse. And if, for example, it gets to a point where a school doesn't properly deal with an issue to do with diversity, that can have a profound impact, especially on the sixth form level, 16 to 18-year-olds. You can't hide these things from sixth form students. They're very hyper aware of them. I know this from experience and from discussing with my peers that we see the issues with diversity, we understand them, and so we see when they're not being dealt with as well. And so it's extremely important that we're seeing diversity at different levels with different authority positions. As someone who is part of marginalised communities, I have been, and many other people have been, made aware of issues of diversity, justice, equality from a young age, and we deserve to be able to identify with authority figures who also understand these issues, and that is most logically achieved through representation. We should be able to go to different levels of authority figures, different contexts of leaders and people with positions of responsibility, and be able to see someone who looks like us and see someone who's experienced what we have and talk to someone who has. And that goes for every individual, every student of an international school, and every student across the world should be able to find someone that they identify with on an authority level within that school. And if they can't, there's a problem. And if you ask the students who aren't able to do this, who aren't able to find someone who they identify with, you will find that they are individuals who are part of marginalized groups. You don't tend to see that majority groups have this issue. And again, that just puts into context what the problem is. It's not necessarily an issue of understaffed or things like that. It's an issue of representation, and representation of the races, the ethnicities, the genders, and the religions that you have. If they're being embraced amongst the student body, then they should also be embraced amongst the faculty. Sixth form students are hyper aware of this and will bring these things up in discussion, and so they deserve to be met with answers when these questions are being asked. I have had one too many experiences where I've raised issues about experiences that I've had where I felt that my rights haven't been protected, or that I'm having an issue to do with lack of diversity or lack of understanding of inclusivity from a teacher, and it's not received with the response that I would like, because on the other end I'm talking to someone who is not representative of me or my concern, and is not understanding, and that should not be a frequent issue, and yet it is. And I'll go back to my peers amongst the sixth form context and talk about this and find how many other students have experienced the same things. You know, they've raised discussions as girls of not feeling safe or not having their rights being understood in terms of the unique experiences they go through as young women, and not being able to discuss it either. And this links into what I mentioned before about, I think the real test comes in of when dealing with these issues. And if countless times the issues aren't being dealt with, that message that's being passed on is not one of encouragement. So when it comes to reporting the problems with diversity, from experience, I found that the main issue is the inclusivity part. It's not feeling like our voices are being heard. Now, to talk specifically about women and girls and the experiences of misogyny, discrimination, or sexism they might feel that they face, and that I have felt that I faced at times, it's already daunting within a world where misogyny seems to not be taken seriously. We see that on the news, we see it on social media, we read about it, we hear about it, we talk about it. And so to see that reflected within an international school environment can be quite daunting. International schools already can feel like our own version of the world. They're diverse and they represent different demographics from around the globe, and so it already feels quite real and quite global. And so when it comes to issues, they can feel a lot more daunting compared to a non-international school. And so again, back to this issue of girls reporting feelings of discrimination, we want to feel like our voices are being heard, and whether that is reflected in the authority figure we're talking to another woman, or whether that's just in the attitude and of inclusivity, that we want that. And I think that's what a lot of institutions might fail to understand, and this is why DEI is so important. And to put that back into the context of the sixth form, the girls in sixth form are young women and young adults, and you have this duality of you are protected within a school environment and context, and there's safeguarding in place, but at the same time you are still a woman in the world. And so there can be a lot of complicated feelings, but the school should be a safe place for you to grow and for you to expand and for you to have discussions about this. And making a school a safe place doesn't mean not talking about what goes wrong in the world, especially within sixth form and with young adults. It's not talking about just what's good and what's right, but it's talking about what doesn't go right, what goes wrong, and how to address that. And that should be done in an environment that is mediated, that is controlled, but it should be done. And that's what inclusivity really is. I think it's having those discussions in the first place, and we should have the space to do that. And so to bring me on to the final section of my discussion, I wanted to just talk about what I would personally like to see in terms of DEI and sixth forms going forwards. I think that sixth forms will continue to be a intellectual environment and a nourishing environment, and there will continue to be individuals who discuss their opinions openly and inclusively. And so I'd like to see that that's also being reflected amongst the faculty. I also would want this to not feel as if it's a movement. I think especially amongst the sort of 21st century context we have politically and socioeconomically, it's very easy for discussions of diversity and striving for equity to feel as though it's just a phase or a trend or a movement for the time. I think that this should be a real moment, a real change, and that it shouldn't feel that it's just, for example, when it comes to representation, just a quota being filled, just a box being ticked, just another sort of agenda being passed, that institutions should be striving to make actual systemic change that is going to last, long-term change. It's not a short-term trend or a phase, but genuine long-term strives for equity. Because if we link back to the beginning, the discussion in equity being the procedures and the processes, it's impactful. It's not just a, quick fix. So I'd like to see that DEI within sixth forms is being taken more seriously. I think as well, in terms of a student level, that this shouldn't feel like a burden for young people and sixth form students. I think for our Generation Z, and the kind of context of the world that we live in, it's very easy for us to be branded as change makers and policy enactors and young advocates, which is great, and I myself am one of them, but it's also not everyone's experience, and I don't think that that should be enforced on young people. At the end of the day, education is a choice, and as I mentioned, especially for sixth form, if you are voluntarily pursuing this further education, you should be given the tools to kind of receive that education and then make a choice with the tools that you've been given. And so I don't think that, again, we should be just branded as activists. We're people, and I think that should be remembered always. And that brings my discussion to a close. Thank you for listening, and I hope that I get to see DEI being implemented further into sixth forms.